Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a law professor at the City University of New York, is the author of the nonfiction book Naming Gotham, the Villains, Rogues, and Heroes Behind New York Place Names, is the author of the Environmental Justice Chronicles graphic novel series, and is the writer of numerous law review articles. Her name is Rebecca Bratspies, and my interview with Rebecca will immediately follow the teleportation sound. Rebecca Bratspies, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hi, everybody. I'm a law professor at CUNY School of Law, and I sort of cosplay as a historian. I've recently written a book about New York City, and I also, in my spare time, and you can put that in air quotes, work with a very talented artist to make a series of environmental justice graphic novels.
Without spoiling too much of your book about New York City place names, which is called Naming Gotham, the Villains, Rogues, and Heroes Behind New York Place Names, what is it about?
Well, the book is about the history of New York City, the history of New York State, and the history of the United States. And I approach it through the lens of the people that we name things after here in New York City. And I use the lives of those individuals as a sort of quirky, fun way into the history of the city and the country. So, we have, let's say, just as an example, a bridge named after Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who was a general during the American Revolution. And so there's a chapter on him, and you learn about Revolutionary War history, you learn about his role in it, and then his role in the wider world. Same thing for civil rights heroes. There's a street here named after Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and there's a park named after Shirley Chisholm. So I take the streets, bridges, parks, whatever, that are named after people, and I use the lives of those people as a way to learn about history.
What got you interested in toponyms? And a toponym, for our listeners who are not familiar with that term, it's the technical term for a place name.
Well, it's sort of a funny story, because what actually got me interested in this was being stuck in traffic on one particular road called the Major Deegan Expressway. And it's anybody who lives in New York who drives a car will take the Major Deegan Expressway because it's one of the main ways to get to the George Washington Bridge. It runs right past Yankee Stadium. So everybody, of course, knows who George Washington is, but nobody had a clue who Major Deegan was, even though this major road is named, no pun intended, is named after him. And it's a road that's notorious for traffic jams, like many other roads in New York City. So I would be sitting there in a traffic jam, and I'd be saying, who was that Major Deegan? I hate him. But I had no idea who he was. So eventually my family got sick of listening to me whine, and they said, well, why don't you find out who the guy was? So I did, and it turned out that he's actually way less impressive than I expected. I sort of was assuming he was a war hero. He was somebody who died in battle leading troops or had done something really spectacular. But it turned out that he was sort of a mid-level bureaucrat in New York City and had a road named after him because he died young and was super popular.
Which place name in New York City do you believe is the most interesting, and why do you believe it is the most interesting one?
Oh, that's a toughie, because, of course, I love them all. So depending on how you define interesting, I would say that Rikers Island is probably among the most interesting. So Rikers Island is the home of the New York City's main jail. And it has a terrible reputation for brutality and for terrible conditions. In fact, Rolling Stone named it one of the 10 worst jails in the United States. And the jail is slated to be closed in 2027 because it's such a disaster. There was an official commission that was headed by the former chief judge of the state, a guy named Jonathan Littman, that declared that the jail was a stain on the city. That's a direct quote, and that it was irredeemable and must be closed. Well, it turns out that the Rikers family has an infamous history going back to the Dutch occupation of Manhattan through the colony of New Netherlands. And at every point in history, that family was sort of at the forefront of oppression and brutality. So the fact that the prison is on an island named after them is sort of history repeating itself over and over again. And the idea is that when the jail closes, it's also going to be renamed. We don't know who it's going to be named for yet, but that's going to be a whole public process to decide sort of what would be a, appropriate sort of community healing kind of way to name the island.
How long did it take you to write Naming Gotham?
Well, I didn't work on it straight through from beginning to end. I worked on it off and on for probably about 5 years. And it was very episodic. I would find somebody who interested me. Like I walked across a bridge called the McCombs Dam Bridge, and that got me really interested in who the McCombs were. And they have a fascinating history that is like all about real estate corruption in New York State and New York City. And it took me a long time to work through them because there was a lot of the documents, especially the documents from the Revolutionary period and afterward, were all handwritten, and they were on the verge of illegible from my perspective. So that one took a very long time. I wrote a chapter about Willits. Willits Point is named after a guy named Charles Willits, and whose son was also named Charles Willits, and it got very confusing and Charles Willits' son was also named Charles Willits, and they didn't do anything like Charles Willits, Charles Willits Jr., Charles Willits III. So sorting out who had done what became very complicated. I spent a lot of time in archives. Really, it was just super fun doing this investigative kind of work. But I also used a lot of newspaper articles because I really wanted the sort of more gossipy information about these people. And I finished it during COVID.
You also write a series of graphic novels called the Environmental Justice Chronicles. Without spoiling too much of the series, how many books are in the series? What are they about? And who is or are the illustrator or illustrators?
So let me start with the last one first. The illustrator is a guy named Charlie LaGreca Velasco, and he is unbelievably talented. They're so beautiful. There are 3 books in the Environmental Justice Chronicles, and they are all available for free download on my website for anybody to read and for anybody to use for a nonprofit or educational use. He and I also are partnering right now with the United Nations to make a series of shorter graphic comics about environmental defenders around the world, which are people who are putting their very lives on the line to try to protect forests or rivers or other ecosystems.
What are the easiest and hardest parts of writing a book for you, whether it be your graphic novel series or your nonfiction book, Naming Gotham?
Mm-hmm. The easiest part, it's not so much that it's easy, it's just the part that I love, is doing the research. I'm a law professor by day, and generally people become law professors because we like to teach and we love doing research. So I love doing really sort of detailed, textured research on the historical figures that I write about in Naming Gotham. And in order to make the comic books as sort of authentic as possible and to flow as possible, the editorial process is super detailed. I work very, very closely with the artist over every frame in the graphic novel. I don't know that that's easy, but that's really fun. The hardest part, I think, is deciding that I'm done. Like, it's really hard to let go of something, at least for me, to say, okay, this is finished. I can let go of it now, because it could always be better, but better is the curse of finishing anything.
The next couple of questions I have are going to be along the same line of questioning. Is Naming Gotham self-published, traditionally published, or published by a hybrid publisher?
It's traditionally published by a small press called History Press. And it is, they've been great to work with. They've given me a lot of flexibility. They have been able to get it into bookstores and into, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and places like that. I highly, if anybody's listening to this, interested in writing about local history, because that's really their specialty, they're a great press to work with. And you don't need an agent to send them a book proposal.
Are the Environmental Justice Chronicles self-published, traditionally published, or hybrid published, and what was the publisher?
Those are self-published. I have a contract with a printer, and we print them out. And then, like I said, they're available for download. Those are not for sale. Those are a project that I work with schools or I work with community groups, and we give them the books. And we get funding from various donors, including city council and foundations, to fund the printing of the books that we then give to people who participate in workshops.
As you mentioned at the start of the interview, you are a law professor at CUNY, which is the City University of New York. What areas of law do you teach, and what is your work as a law professor like?
My work as a law professor, I teach a slew of environmental classes. So I teach environmental law, environmental justice, climate change, human rights in the environment, an array of classes about environmental law on the hyper-local sort of New York level, as well as the national level and the international level. I also teach property law, which is the law about buying, selling, and owning and using real property in the world, meaning land and buildings on land. And then I teach a class called administrative law, which is about how agencies like the Department of Education or the Department of Motor Vehicles, how they function, how they make decisions, and how they make rules. And so it's a sort of a broad array of topics. I love teaching. It's really, being in the classroom is so much fun. It just brings me joy working with students.
I mentioned your work as a law professor in the previous question because you've written law review articles in addition to books. How many law review articles have you written, and what are some topics you've written law review articles about?
Oh, gosh. I actually can't tell you how many law review articles I've written. Probably around 50, maybe, but, at some point you stop counting. I write mostly about environmental questions. So about, in particular, I focus on environmental justice, which is how we distribute pollution and other environmental bads like that in our society, as well as who has access to what we consider environmental amenities, things like parks and trees and, nice, safe, clean environments. So I write a lot about that. I write about the human right to a healthy environment. I write also about regulating agriculture, and I haven't written about that in a while, though, and about access to food, and about, let's see, what else do I write about? Handling of waste. I also have written a couple of books that I am not sort of thinking anyone who's listening to this is probably going to want to read. For example, one of them is called Transboundary Harm in International Law, Lessons from the Trail Smelter Arbitration. I think it's fascinating, but it's not really the kind of thing that anybody's going to pick up unless they have a reason to. But, let me add one more thing. But If anybody is interested in my scholarship, it is also all available online for free. There are links on my website.
Now, one final question I have is kind of New York City specific, but the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, recently announced a updated trash collection policy in the city in which trash bins will have to be used. What are your thoughts about that, and as well as your thoughts about the history of trash collection in New York City?
So that's the history of trash collection is actually a fascinating topic. But first, let me talk about the fact that we meaning New York City, just paid McKinsey $3 million in a consulting contract to tell us that, yes, it's better to control rats if you put trash in trash bins rather than just piling up trash bags on the street corner. The fact that we needed someone to tell us that is, to my mind, remarkable. Most modern cities in the world have their trash containerized and have for a very long time. New York was really an outlier on this. I'm very glad that that's changing because it is disgusting to see all the trash piled up in bags on the street corners. It also has led to a thriving rat population here in New York City. That is not really something we're particularly happy about. In terms of the history, that gets us back into environmental justice because New York City has a long history of steering all of the management of its trash into a handful of overburdened communities, most of which are communities of color. And so it has been a very long environmental justice fight to try to make sure that all communities have good trash pickup and that the sort of processing of all of the waste that we collect, because New York right now generates 12 tons of waste a day. 12,000 tons of waste a day. I said that wrong. That is not all concentrated into just a couple, three communities of color. And to make sure that everybody who generates trash has some stake in trying to manage it properly and reduce its production by spreading out the waste transfer stations where the white garbage trucks that go around the city collecting trash dump the trash so that it can be transferred into either rail cars or long haul trucks to be taken for disposal, because we don't dispose of any of our own trash in New York anymore. It all goes to either Ohio, Pennsylvania, upstate New York, or Virginia.
Rebecca, you were a very fascinating and amazing guest, and I thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Oh, well, you were very kind. It's been fun talking with you. I know I talk really quickly. Can I just add that I know I mentioned that a bunch of stuff is on my website. If you want to check out the Environmental Justice Chronicles, and I encourage people to do it, the artist is so talented. They're beautiful. And the Earth Justice Chronicles as well. You can find it all on my website, which is just my name, RebeccaBratspies.com. There are links to my scholarship there. And if you want to find out more about Naming Gotham, the book, it's also, there's a bunch of information about it there, as well as some blog posts I wrote about people that didn't make it into the book. Not because they weren't cool, but just because I ran out of space.
I will include a link to the book trailer video for Naming Gotham that Rebecca mentioned during the interview in the text description of this episode, as it's an excellent nonfiction book trailer. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.